My fiancé let his family harass me over my late father's past, so I publicly exposed their darkest secrets and kicked them out of my life. But fast forward to now, he's back, standing in my parking lot at midnight, watching my window, thinking of what to do to me. My fiancé and his family ridiculed my deceased father at our engagement party, so I gave him my wedding ring and never looked back. I'm 31, and a few months ago, I used to be engaged to Ben. We met at a work party about 5 years ago, and I still remember how he got everyone laughing with these weirdest trivia facts. Ben came from money. His family owned a chain of medical practices, and his parents Richard and Caroline were obsessed with what they called good breeding. At first I thought they were just snobby, but over time I realized it went deeper than that. As for my parents, my mom wasn't in the picture, and my dad died 3 years ago from liver failure. He was an alcoholic for most of my childhood, but got sober when I was 15. The last 13 years of his life he worked as an addiction counselor and helped dozens of people get clean. I became a social worker because of him. Ben knew all this and always seemed supportive. The problem started at a country club brunch with Ben's parents. Caroline asked about my family medical history for insurance purposes, and I told her about my dad's addiction and recovery. She literally froze mid-smile. Richard cleared his throat and changed the subject. Later, Ben pulled me aside and suggested maybe I shouldn't mention the addiction thing to other people. I should have seen the red flags then, but I brushed it off. Things got worse at a family dinner when Ben's brother Mark, who's a doctor, started making jokes about genetics and addictive personalities. He'd wait until I took a sip of wine, then say things like, "You know, addiction runs in families." Caroline was no better. Her eyes followed my hand every time I reached for my glass, and I didn't miss the way her lips pursed when I poured a second one. Ben's sister Lisa leaned forward and said, "I've been reading about children of alcoholics, and apparently they're 3 times more likely to develop problems." She said it like she was discussing the weather. When I mentioned it to Ben later, he laughed and said, "They're just looking out for you. Don't worry, my parents love you," all while rubbing my shoulder reassuringly. But after that conversation, I overheard Ben talking about genetic screening and protecting family assets. When I confronted him, he finally admitted the truth. His parents wanted me to sign papers agreeing to genetic counseling before we had kids because they wanted to test me for addiction genes. He tried to encourage me to do it, saying alcoholism runs in families. If my own fiancé not trusting me wasn't bad enough, I later found out that someone had printed my dad's obituary and used a yellow highlighter on every mention of his addiction. They'd circled years of struggle and battle with alcoholism, like they were building a case against me. The engagement party was when everything exploded. Richard stood up with his champagne glass and gave a toast about choosing partners with good genes and being grateful for their clean family history. He looked right at me when he said clean. Caroline chimed in about how some families have unfortunate weaknesses that get passed down like a curse. She too stared right at me when she said curse. Mark made a crack about how at least I'd know the signs when our kids start drinking, and everyone laughed. I had never felt so humiliated, and I honestly couldn't believe that Ben wasn't saying anything. He was just sitting there sipping his wine and glancing at me to make sure I wasn't touching the wine bottle. Honestly, I thought that was the most awful it would get. But then Richard announced they'd hired a private investigator to research my family history and proceeded to pull out a folder from God knows where and started reading from it. They'd found records of my grandfather's alcoholism and my great-uncle's addiction. They'd tracked down distant cousins with DUIs. They actually made a family tree on poster board with all the affected members marked in red ink. My dad's name was circled 3 times. Richard held it up like he was presenting evidence in court. The final straw was when Caroline suggested I should consider getting sterilized to avoid passing on the addiction gene. She said it like she was doing me a favor. Ben just sat there nodding along, but I had enough. I stood up in front of everyone and told them about Caroline's Xanax addiction that she thought nobody knew about. I'd found the pills when I was helping her organize her bathroom. Richard's 2 DUIs that he'd paid to make disappear. Mark's white powder problem in med school that almost got him expelled. I had screenshots and receipts for everything because I'd started keeping records after that first dinner when something felt off. I told everyone how my dad died saving lives, how he sponsored 37 people who are still sober today, how he never missed a single day of work at the treatment center even when he was dying, how proud I was to be his daughter. Then I took off my engagement ring and dropped it in Ben's champagne glass. The whole room went silent. I walked out while they all sat there with their mouths open. 2 days later, Ben showed up with an envelope full of photos he'd secretly taken during our most intimate moments. He was standing at my door holding them like playing cards. I felt sick to my stomach. He pushed past me into my apartment and spread them out on my coffee table. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There were dozens of them. He told me I needed to sign a statement saying everything I said about his family was lies. He had already typed it up and everything. The paper said I was mentally unstable and making false accusations because of my family history of addiction. I grabbed the photos and tried to tear them up, but he pulled out his phone. He had backups of everything. I told him to get out of my apartment. He said if I didn't sign the paper, he'd send the photos to my boss at the social services office. He knew how conservative my workplace was. He knew it would destroy my career. I pushed him toward the door, but he wouldn't leave. He kept waving his phone in my face, showing me the email he'd already drafted to my supervisor. My hands were shaking, but I managed to stay calm. I told him what he was doing was illegal. He laughed and said his family had the best lawyers in the state. He said nobody would believe the daughter of an alcoholic over a respected medical family. He gave me 24 hours to sign the paper, or he'd hit send. After he left, I called the police. 2 officers showed up and took my statement. I explained about the photos and the threats. They said without proof of the blackmail, there wasn't much they could do. One of them suggested I change my locks. The other one recognized Ben's last name and got quiet. I knew right then they wouldn't help me. The next morning, Caroline showed up at my work. She walked right past reception like she owned the place. She found my desk and started talking loudly about how concerned she was about me. She told my coworker Nancy that I was going through a difficult time and struggling with the same demons as my poor father. She put her hand on Nancy's arm and said she was worried I might be drinking at work. Nancy looked confused and tried to get back to her computer, but Caroline kept going. She said addiction was a family disease and she just wanted to help me before it was too late. She pulled out pamphlets for rehab centers and left them on my desk. By the time I got back from a client meeting, half the office was whispering about it. My supervisor Margaret called me into into her office that afternoon. She asked if everything was okay at home. She mentioned Caroline's visit and said she was concerned about the allegations. I tried to explain, but Margaret cut me off. She said she had to take any substance abuse concerns seriously given our work with vulnerable populations. She suggested I take a few days off to sort things out. I went home feeling defeated. When I got to my apartment building, I saw a moving truck outside. I ran upstairs to find the locks had been changed on the apartment Ben and I were supposed to share next month. All my stuff was in boxes in the hallway. The super said Ben had shown him the lease with only Ben's name on it. I'd been stupid enough to let him handle the paperwork. I started going through the boxes looking for my dad's things. His AA medallions weren't there. Neither was his journal or the photo album from his counseling center. The box with all his personal effects was missing. I called Ben, but he didn't answer. I texted him demanding my dad's things back. He replied with a photo of my dad's 10-year medallion and said I could have it back when I signed the statement. I had to call my friend Tyler to help me move everything to my current apartment. While we were loading boxes into his truck, a courier showed up. He handed me an envelope from Richard's law firm. Inside was a formal demand for $50,000. The letter said they'd spent that amount on wedding preparations, and I owed them for breach of promise to marry. It listed everything from the venue deposit to Caroline's mother's dress alterations. I couldn't afford a lawyer, so I went to legal aid. The volunteer there said breach of promise lawsuits were rare, but not impossible. She said I'd need to prove they were harassing me. I showed her the letter and explained about the photos. She said to document everything and start building a case. She also suggested I check my credit report and bank statements. That's when I discovered Ben had been intercepting my mail. Several credit card statements were missing. When I called the bank, they said my address had been changed 3 weeks ago. Ben had been getting all my financial information sent to his office. He knew exactly how much money I had and where it was. The bank lady said someone had tried to add an authorized user to my account, but the request was denied. I spent the next day on the phone with every financial institution I could think of. I changed all my passwords and put fraud alerts on everything. My friend Alexis worked at a different bank and noticed some weird activity when she helped me open a new account. Someone had been making small test deposits and withdrawals like they were mapping out my finances. She helped me lock everything down and move my money around. Meanwhile, Mark started showing up at my work meetings. He'd somehow figured out my schedule and would just happen to be at the same coffee shop or building lobby. He'd wave and smile like we were old friends. Then he'd strike up conversations with whoever I was meeting. He told my biggest client that I was under investigation for insurance fraud. He said he couldn't go into details, but they should be careful. The client called my boss the next day and pulled their account. I lost a $20,000 contract because of that lie. The Henderson Group had been my biggest client, and when they called to terminate our agreement, citing concerns about professional stability, I knew exactly where those concerns had originated. Margaret called me back into her office that same afternoon. Her usually warm demeanor had cooled considerably. She sat behind her mahogany desk, fingers steepled, looking at me like I was a problem to be solved. "I'm getting concerned about all the drama affecting our workplace," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. The afternoon sun slanted through her office blinds, casting sharp shadows across her face. "Perhaps you should take extended leave until things calm down." I tried to explain that Ben's family was targeting me, that this was deliberate harassment, but she just kept saying she had to think about the agency's reputation. Her voice had that careful, measured tone people use when they've already made up their minds. 20 years of building my career at this firm, and it was crumbling because of lies. That night, I found Ben's silver BMW parked outside my apartment building. He was just sitting there in the dark, engine off, watching my third-floor windows. The streetlight illuminated half his face, making him look like something out of a horror movie. I stood at my window for a moment, watching him watch me, feeling my skin crawl. I took photos with my phone, making sure to capture his license plate and the timestamp. When I called the police, the dispatcher sounded bored. They said he wasn't breaking any laws by sitting in his car on a public street. I asked what I had to do to get a restraining order. The officer's voice turned patronizing as he explained I needed proof of threats or violence. Apparently, blackmail didn't count without evidence. The next morning, there were notes under my windshield wiper, damp from the morning dew. Not threatening exactly, but deeply unsettling. One said, "Your father would be disappointed," in Ben's distinctive handwriting, the same careful script I'd once found charming. Another said, "Genetics always win," with a crude drawing of a DNA helix. A third simply had my father's sobriety date with a question mark after it. I stood in the parking lot, hands shaking as I carefully placed each note in a plastic bag. I kept them in a folder with everything else. Screenshots, emails, text messages. My documentation pile was getting thick, but nobody seemed to care about any of it. Caroline escalated her workplace visits with theatrical flair. She started bringing elaborate baked goods to my office, homemade cookies in decorative tins, fresh bread wrapped in checkered cloth, acting like some demented 1950s housewife. She'd sweep through reception with a concerned smile, telling everyone she was worried I wasn't eating properly. "You know how stress affects appetite," she'd say, patting the receptionist's hand, especially with a family history of, well, you know. She'd corner people in the break room, speaking in hushed, worried tones about my mental state. I overheard her telling Janet from accounting that she'd noticed concerning changes in my behavior. "The paranoia is really troubling," Caroline said, shaking her head sadly. "It runs in families, you know." Her poor father struggled with reality too. She told the receptionist she'd noticed I'd lost weight and wondered if I was using substances. The way she said substances made it sound like I was shooting up in the bathroom. She even brought a substance test kit once, an actual over-the-counter substance test, and left it on my desk with a note written on her medical practice letterhead. "Just in case you want to prove everyone wrong. We're here to help when you're ready." The sheer audacity of it took my breath away. My coworkers started giving me strange looks, conversations stopping when I entered rooms. I complained to HR, but they said she wasn't technically doing anything wrong. She was just a concerned family friend dropping by. They suggested I talk to her directly about boundaries, as if this was some simple misunderstanding between reasonable people. When I tried calling her, she wouldn't answer. Her voicemail message was syrupy sweet. "You've reached Dr. Caroline Morrison. If this is a medical emergency, please hang up and dial 911. When I showed up at her house, a sprawling colonial in the suburbs, Richard answered the door and threatened to call the police for trespassing. "You're not welcome here," he said, his surgeon's hands hands gripping the doorframe. Stay away from our family. I was trapped in this weird game where they could harass me, but I couldn't even talk to them. Then my landlord called. Mr. Petrov had owned the building for 30 years and had always been fair to me. His voice was troubled as he explained he'd received a letter from Richard's law firm claiming I was being evicted from my previous apartment for property damage. The letter included photos of a trashed apartment, holes in walls, broken fixtures, carpet stained with what looked like wine or blood. It wasn't even my old apartment. I recognized it as a unit from a building across town that I'd never lived in. I know this is bullshit, Mr. Petrov said, his Russian accent thickening with anger. I called your previous landlord myself. You were a perfect tenant, but I wanted you to know someone is trying very hard to damage your reputation. He'd been in business long enough to recognize a smear campaign, he said. Be careful. People with this much money and time, they can be dangerous. I started varying my routines obsessively. I'd park in different spots, sometimes walking an extra 3 blocks just to avoid patterns. I'd take different routes to work, leaving at odd times, doubling back to check if I was being followed. But Mark always seemed to find me anyway. He'd materialize at the grocery store while I was comparing yogurt prices, at the gym while I was on the treadmill, always maintaining that doctor's professional smile. Funny running into you here, he'd say, as if our encounters were coincidence. He'd make small talk about genetics and family medical history, working in little digs disguised as concern. You know, mental illness is highly heritable, he mentioned once while we both waited at the deli counter. Have you ever been screened? Given your family history, it might be wise. Once he asked if I'd considered getting my tubes tied since mental illness ran in my family too. It's the responsible choice, he said, selecting organic turkey. Some genetic lines should end. I started recording our conversations on my phone, keeping it in my pocket with the voice memo app running. The breaking point came when I went to visit my dad's grave on a gray Thursday afternoon. I brought fresh daisies like I did every month, his favorite flowers, simple and honest like he'd been in his sober years. But when I got there, someone had already visited. Empty beer bottles were arranged around his headstone like some sick shrine. Budweiser, his old brand. They'd poured alcohol on his grave, the smell of stale beer mixing with the scent of cut grass. The groundskeeper, an elderly man named Eduardo, who'd always been kind to me, said a well-dressed couple had been there earlier claiming to be family. The description matched Richard and Caroline perfectly. They said they were his brother and sister-in-law, Eduardo explained, wringing his hands. I'm so sorry. If I'd known. I sat there crying and cleaning up the mess with paper towels from my car. My dad had been sober for 13 years before the cancer took him. He'd been so proud of his sobriety chips, keeping them in a special box by his bed. And they'd desecrated his grave with alcohol, turning his greatest triumph into a mockery. It was cruel beyond words. I took photos of everything. The bottles, the stained granite, my father's name obscured by their vandalism. I added them to my growing file. But photos of beer bottles weren't proof of anything according to the police. They said anyone could have left them there. Maybe some kids, the officer suggested. It happens. Ben started getting bolder with his harassment, like he was testing boundaries. The calls came at all hours from blocked numbers, sometimes silence, sometimes breathing. Once I heard what sounded like my father's favorite song playing faintly in the background. He'd send food delivery to my apartment at 3 in the morning, always alcohol. Cases of beer, bottles of wine, making the delivery drivers knock insistently until I answered. This is harassment, I told one confused driver holding a case of vodka. I didn't order this, but they'd always say it was prepaid. The order confirmed. He'd sign me up for addiction recovery newsletters and have them sent to my workplace. Brochures for rehab facilities would appear on my desk. AA meeting schedules were tucked under my windshield wipers. Everything was designed to make me look unstable and prove his family's point about genetics and weakness. The psychological warfare was exhausting. I found out he'd been calling my references and telling them I was in rehab when Jennifer, my former supervisor from my first job out of college, called to check on me. Her voice was full of concern. Ben called claiming to be from an intervention service, she said. He was asking about your drinking history, whether I'd ever noticed problems. I didn't believe him. You were always professional, but I wanted to make sure you were okay. She'd known me for 15 years and didn't believe the lies, but how many others had he called? How many people now thought I had a problem I didn't have? My professional network was being poisoned one call at a time. My friend Robin worked in IT and had skills I desperately needed. She helped me trace some of the harassment, working on her laptop in my living room while I paced anxiously. The blocked calls were coming from burner phones purchased with cash, but the delivery orders had IP addresses. They traced back to the medical practice's Wi-Fi network. It's not definitive proof, Robin said, adjusting her glasses, but it's something. They're getting sloppy. She also helped me set up security cameras around my apartment, cheap ones from Amazon that I couldn't really afford but couldn't live without. We positioned them to cover my door, the parking lot, and the mailbox area. The financial harassment escalated into something that felt like economic warfare. Richard's law firm sent new demands every week, each one more outrageous than the last. Now they wanted $70,000 for emotional distress. They claimed I'd slandered their family name and damaged their medical practice's reputation. They included screenshots of negative reviews that mentioned the engagement party incident, reviews posted by accounts created the day after the party, all with generic names and no other activity. I knew they'd probably written those reviews themselves, but I couldn't prove it. The letters came on expensive letterhead, delivered by certified mail, each one a fresh reminder of how outmatched I was. Then Caroline filed a police report saying I'd stolen jewelry at the engagement party. She claimed a diamond bracelet and earrings were missing. Family heirlooms, she said, worth at least $15,000. She had photos of herself wearing them at the party, and receipts showing their value. 2 days later, the police showed up at my apartment with a search warrant. 3 officers went through everything while I stood there in shock, watching them rifle through my underwear drawer, dump out my jewelry box, check inside my shoes. Of course they didn't find anything because I hadn't taken anything. I'd never even seen the jewelry she described. The search was beyond humiliating. My neighbors peered out their doors, watching the police cars with their flashing lights. Mrs. Chen from across the hall wouldn't make eye contact with me afterward. My landlord called again, his voice strained. I believe you, Mr. Petrov said, but other tenants are complaining. They're scared. If police visits continue, I'll have to reconsider your lease. I'm sorry, but I have a business to run. I felt like the walls were closing in on me from every direction. Ben's family orchestrating my isolation isolation with surgical precision. I went to stay with Tyler for a few days just to get away from my apartment and the constant anxiety of waiting for the next attack. His spare room was small but felt safer than my own home, but somehow Ben found out where I was. Tyler woke me at 6 in the morning, his face pale. All 4 of his car tires had been slashed overnight, the cuts deep and deliberate. His mailbox was stuffed with addiction pamphlets addressed to me. Understanding your alcoholic friend, when love isn't enough. Intervention strategies that work. His front door had been plastered with AA stickers. Tyler was supportive, but I could tell he was getting scared. "This is insane," he said, looking at his destroyed tires. "Who does this?" I didn't blame him for being frightened. Ben's family had money and connections. They could afford to be patient, to slowly destroy everything around me. Fighting them felt impossible, like trying to hold back the ocean with my bare hands. At work, things deteriorated rapidly. Margaret put me on administrative leave pending an investigation into the fraud allegations. "It's just protocol," she said, not meeting my eyes as she handed me the letter. "Until we can clear this up." But I knew my career was hanging by a thread. Without my income, I couldn't afford a lawyer to fight Richard's demands. My savings were dwindling, spent on security cameras and changing locks and gas for constantly varied routes. Ben's family was systematically destroying my life, and I couldn't stop them. Then I got a break. My coworker Brenda called on a Tuesday evening, her voice hushed and urgent. "You need to see something," she said. She'd been working late on a presentation and decided to check the security cameras after all the strange visits. The footage showed Caroline in the building after hours, moving through the darkened hallways with purpose. She'd somehow gotten a key card and was in the offices alone. Brenda fast-forwarded to show Caroline near my desk in the file room, spending almost an hour in the building. "This is from 3 days before she filed that theft report," Brenda said, her finger pointing at the timestamp. "We watched Caroline go through my desk drawers, check my file cabinet, even look through my coat pockets. She had a small bag with her and appeared to put something inside it. Then she went to my work locker and did something we couldn't quite make out. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was clear she was up to something." I asked Brenda to save the footage. She made multiple copies and gave them to me on a flash drive. "Be careful," she said, looking around nervously. "These people seem dangerous." I hugged her, grateful to have someone who believed me, who could see what was really happening. Robin helped me enhance the footage using some software she had. Frame by frame, we could see Caroline put something in her bag near my locker, something that caught the light like jewelry. Then she went to my desk and appeared to plant something in my bottom drawer. The quality wasn't great, but it was clear she was up to something. "This is it," Robin said. "This is evidence of them framing you." I finally had proof of their harassment. It wasn't everything, but it was more than I'd had before. I took the footage to the police the next morning. The same officer who'd dismissed me before watched it with a frown, his skepticism slowly morphing into concern. "This is interesting," he admitted, but she could claim she was retrieving her own property or had permission to be there. Still, he agreed to add it to the file. He also mentioned, almost offhandedly, that Caroline had been calling the station frequently, asking about the investigation's progress. "She seems very eager for us to arrest you," he said, almost too eager. The next day, I found my dad's journal pages scattered in my car like confetti. They were torn and crumpled, some pages missing entirely. Someone had highlighted every mention of his drinking days in yellow marker, circling words like hammered and blackout and rock bottom. They'd written genetics in the margins in red pen, like father like daughter across one page. My car had been locked, so I knew Ben still had my spare key from when we dated. But the worst part was seeing my dad's private thoughts violated like that. Those pages were sacred to me, his honest account of his journey to sobriety. He'd given them to me before he died, saying he wanted me to understand his struggle. Now they were being used as weapons against me. I installed a dash cam that day, depleting my checking account further. It was a basic model, but it would record anyone approaching my car. I also started carrying pepper spray and keeping my phone recording in my pocket during any encounters. I felt paranoid, jumping at shadows, checking locks obsessively, but Ben's family had proven they'd cross any line. I had to protect myself even if the police wouldn't. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Austin Chen, who worked as office manager at the medical practice, reached out through LinkedIn with a cryptic message. "We need to talk about R&C, not safe here." We arranged to meet at a diner 40 minutes outside town, a place where we wouldn't be recognized. Austin looked nervous when he arrived, constantly checking over his shoulder. He'd worked for the practice for 10 years, he explained, starting right out of college. "I thought they were good people," he said, clutching his coffee cup. "But what they're doing to you, it's evil. And it's not the first time they've destroyed someone who got in their way." He pulled out a thumb drive and slid it across the table. "Hundreds of emails," he said. "Richard's been discussing your removal with Caroline for months. They planned everything like a military operation." The emails detailed strategies for harassment, discussions about hiring the private investigator, plans to discredit me at work. Caroline had bragged about getting my keycard from Ben and using it to access my workplace. She called it planting seeds of doubt, Austin said, his voice disgusted. But the emails revealed something even bigger. Richard had been using the medical practice to bill insurance companies for procedures that never happened. Ghost patients, fake treatments, inflated costs. He'd been doing it for years and had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars. Caroline helped by altering patient records, creating false documentation. Mark knew about it too, had even participated by filing false claims for consultations that never occurred. The whole family was involved in massive fraud. "I've been gathering evidence for months," Austin explained, his hands shaking slightly. "I knew something illegal was happening, but I was scared. They have connections everywhere. But watching them destroy you, I couldn't stay silent anymore." He gave me everything. Patient records, billing statements, recorded conversations he'd secretly made. "I'm leaving town tomorrow," he said, starting fresh somewhere else. "But someone needs to have this evidence in case something happens to me." I spent the next 2 days going through everything with Robin. The fraud was extensive and meticulously documented. Richard had been careful, but not careful enough. He'd used his work email for everything, probably thinking he was untouchable. The evidence showed years of systematic theft, patients billed for surgeries they never had, insurance companies defrauded of millions. We organized everything into clear files with summaries and timelines, creating a roadmap of criminal activity that spanned nearly a decade. But I needed more proof of what they'd done to me specifically. The dash cam finally paid off when it caught Ben breaking into my car car again at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday. The footage was crystal clear thanks to the streetlight. He had a key and was placing more torn journal pages on my seat, arranging them carefully for maximum impact. He looked directly at the camera without realizing it was there, his face perfectly visible. That familiar sneer I'd once mistaken for confidence. I finally had him on video committing a crime. I made copies of everything and distributed them strategically. One went to Tyler, hidden in his apartment. One to Brenda, who locked it in her safe deposit box. One to Robin, who uploaded it to multiple cloud services. And one to a safety deposit box I rented at a bank across town. I wasn't taking any chances. If they came for me, the evidence would survive. Then I went back to the police with everything. This time I got Detective Sarah Chen, a financial crime specialist who actually listened. She watched the dashcam footage and read through some of the emails, her expression growing more serious with each page. "This is beyond simple harassment," she said. "The insurance fraud makes it a federal crime. We're talking major felonies here." She called in additional detectives, and within hours they'd opened a real investigation. They took all my evidence, made official copies, and said they'd be in touch. For the first time in weeks, I felt like someone was actually listening. But I knew Ben's family wouldn't go down without a fight. Sure enough, the next day, Richard showed up at my apartment. I heard him in the hallway, arguing with Mr. Petrov, demanding to be let in. When I foolishly opened my door to see what was happening, he pushed his way past me. His face was red and contorted with rage. Nothing like the composed surgeon who'd once intimidated me with his calm demeanor. "What did you do?" he shouted, backing me against my kitchen counter. "Austin's disappeared and the FBI seized our computers. Years of work destroyed because of your vindictive lies." He grabbed my arm, his surgeon's fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "You're going to fix this. You're going to tell them it was all a misunderstanding, or I'll destroy you completely. You think this was bad? I haven't even started." I managed to pull away, my arm throbbing. "Get out or I'll call the police," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He laughed, an ugly sound. "The police? I've donated to their campaigns for years. The mayor comes to my Christmas parties. You're nothing. A nobody with a hammered for a father and delusions of importance." But then his phone rang. I watched his face go from red to white as his lawyer spoke. Federal agents were at the medical practice seizing records. There was a warrant for his arrest. Richard looked at me with pure hatred, the mask finally completely off. "This isn't over," he said. "You've destroyed my family, but we'll destroy you. Even from prison, we'll destroy you." Then he left, slamming my door so hard the frame cracked. I immediately called Detective Chen to report the threat, my hands shaking as I described the encounter. She said she'd send someone immediately and to lock my doors. As I waited for the police, I looked around my apartment at the security cameras, the pepper spray, the folder of evidence, all the ways my life had warped around Ben's family's harassment. But I'd survived. They'd tried to destroy me with lies about genetics and weakness, but I'd fought back with truth. My father would have been proud. The police showed up within 10 minutes. 2 officers took photos of my bruised arm and the cracked door frame. They said Richard was already in custody when they got the call about him being at my apartment. Apparently, he'd gone straight from threatening me to his lawyer's office where federal agents were waiting. The timing couldn't have been better. Detective Chen called that evening with updates. They'd arrested Richard at his lawyer's office and he was being held without bail. The FBI had been investigating the medical practice for months based on anonymous tips. Austin's evidence just gave them everything they needed to move forward. Caroline was picked up at her Pilates class. She apparently made a scene, screaming about her husband's donations to the police foundation. Mark tried to run, but they caught him at the airport with a one-way ticket to Costa Rica. I thought that would be the end of it, but Ben was still out there. He'd been smart enough to stay away from the fraud, but stupid enough to keep harassing me. The next morning, I woke up to find my car covered in eggs and shaving cream. The dash cam caught him doing it at 4 a.m., looking directly at the camera again like he'd forgotten it was there. He'd written "hammered" on my windshield in shaving cream, real mature for a 34-year-old man. I was cleaning it off when my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, finally talked to me again. She handed me a towel and said she'd seen Ben hanging around the building. She'd called the police, but he'd left before they arrived. She apologized for avoiding me after the search. Her nephew had problems with addiction, and she'd been scared, but she'd been watching, and she knew I wasn't drinking. She'd seen me come home from work every day, never stumbling or smelling like alcohol. Sometimes neighbors notice more than you think. That afternoon, Brenda called with shocking news. Caroline had been caught on the building's loading dock camera trying to break in again. This was after she'd made bail, violating the conditions immediately. She had bolt cutters and was trying to get through the back entrance. Security called the police, and she was arrested again. This time, the judge revoked her bail completely. She'd spend the months until trial in jail. The investigation kept expanding. Other employees came forward about the fraud. Patients who'd been overcharged wanted to testify. The FBI found offshore accounts with millions in stolen funds. Every day brought new revelations about how deep the corruption went. Local news picked up the story. Prominent medical family arrested in million-dollar fraud scheme, ran in the paper. They used Richard's professional headshot where he looked so respectable. If only people knew what he was really like. Ben must have seen the news because his harassment escalated. He started leaving dead flowers on my car. He signed me up for hundreds of email lists about addiction and mental health. He had pizza delivered to my apartment every night for a week, always paid in cash. The delivery drivers started recognizing me. One kid said, "Rough breakup?" and I just nodded. If only it were that simple. I kept documenting everything. The dash cam was worth every penny I'd spent on it. It caught Ben keying my car one night, dragging his keys along the driver's side while looking around nervously. It caught him putting glue in my locks. It caught him leaving a box on my hood that turned out to be full of empty beer bottles and a note that said, "For when you're ready to be like daddy." The security cameras at my apartment caught him trying to pick my lock at 3 a.m. He was terrible at it, fumbling with the tools he'd clearly just bought. He gave up after 20 minutes, but the attempt was enough for Detective Chen. She got a warrant for his arrest on multiple counts of harassment, stalking, and attempted breaking and entering. They picked him up at his office the next day. His arrest was almost anticlimactic. I'd expected some dramatic confrontation, but he just went quietly. His lawyer showed up within an hour talking about mental distress and temporary insanity, but the dash cam footage was too clear. The pattern of harassment was too well documented. The judge denied bail, citing the extensive evidence and pattern of escalation. Ben would wait for trial in jail just like his parents, with all of them locked up up, I could finally breathe. I went back to work where Margaret apologized profusely. The fraud allegations had been officially dropped and the agency wanted to make things right. They offered me a raise and a promotion to senior social worker. Some of my coworkers were awkward at first, but most were supportive. Janet from accounting brought me coffee and said she never believed the rumors. Nancy said she knew Caroline was lying the moment she showed up with those substance tests. The Henderson group called wanting to renew their contract. They'd seen the news and realized they'd been lied to. They offered to pay extra to make up for the inconvenience. I accepted their apology but kept the rate the same. I wasn't trying to profit from this mess. I just wanted my life back. Mr. Petrov called to check on me. He said he was proud of how I'd handled everything. He'd had his own run-ins with rich bullies when he first came to America. He reduced my rent for the next 3 months to help with the legal costs. I tried to refuse, but he insisted. Good tenants are hard to find, he said, especially ones who stand up to corruption. The trial started 6 months later. I had to testify in both the fraud case and the harassment case. It was nerve-wracking, but I just told the truth. The prosecutor had organized all the evidence beautifully. Emails, financial records, security footage, everything painted a clear picture. Austin flew back to testify too. He looked healthier, said he was working for a nonprofit now, and loved it. Richard's trial was first. He tried to look dignified in his orange jumpsuit, but the evidence was overwhelming. Patient after patient testified about being overcharged. Insurance investigators detailed the millions in false claims. His own emails showed he knew exactly what he was doing. The jury found him guilty on all counts. He got 15 years in federal prison and had to pay back everything he stole. Caroline's trial was next. She tried to play the victim, claiming Richard forced her to help, but her emails showed she was an eager participant. She'd even come up with some of the schemes herself. The security footage of her planting evidence in my locker was particularly damaging. She was found guilty and got 12 years. The judge called her actions a betrayal of public trust. Mark pleaded guilty to avoid trial. He cooperated with prosecutors and got a reduced sentence of 5 years. He had to surrender his medical license and pay massive fines. His career was over before it really began. All that education wasted because he thought he was above the law. Ben's trial was last. His lawyer tried everything: temporary insanity, emotional distress, even claiming I'd led him on. But the evidence was too strong. Hours of dash cam footage, security videos, documented harassment over months. The torn journal pages were especially damaging. The prosecutor called it a campaign of psychological torture. He was found guilty of stalking, harassment, blackmail, and attempted breaking and entering. He got 3 years in state prison and a permanent restraining order. After the trials ended, I finally got my father's belongings back. Everything was returned, including his AA medallions and journal. Some pages were missing, but I had copies from before. I put everything in a new memory box and kept it somewhere safe. These items meant everything to me, and I'd fought hard to get them back. The civil suit was straightforward after the criminal convictions. My lawyer said it was one of the easiest cases she'd ever handled. The harassment was documented, the damages were clear, and they'd already been found guilty of crimes against me. We settled out of court for $200,000 to be paid from the seized assets. I didn't want their money, but my lawyer said I deserved compensation for what they'd put me through. I used some of the money to pay off my dad's remaining medical bills. The rest went to the treatment center where he'd worked. They used it to create a scholarship fund for people who couldn't afford treatment. They named it after my father. He would have loved that, helping people get sober even after he was gone. Tyler and I stayed friends, though it took time to get back to normal. He had to replace all 4 tires and deal with his own trauma from being dragged into the mess, but he stood by me through everything. He even testified about the harassment at his home. Real friends show up when things get ugly. Robin helped me upgrade my security systems with better cameras and smart locks. She said I'd probably never need them again, but peace of mind was worth it. She also helped me completely overhaul my digital security. New passwords, 2-factor authentication on everything, regular credit monitoring. Ben's family had taught me to never be careless with personal information again. I started seeing a therapist to deal with everything that happened. Dr. Kim helped me process the trauma and paranoia. Being stalked and harassed for months leaves marks even after it stops. She helped me feel safe again, to stop checking locks obsessively and jumping at unexpected noises. Recovery isn't just for addiction. Sometimes it's for surviving someone else's cruelty. A year later, I was promoted again at work. My experience with the legal system made me better at advocating for clients. I understood what it felt like to be dismissed and not believed. I knew how it felt when systems that should protect you fail. It made me fiercer in fighting for the vulnerable people I served. I kept visiting my dad's grave with fresh daisies. The groundskeeper Eduardo always waved when he saw me. He'd added extra attention to that section of the cemetery, keeping it especially neat. The grass grew back where the beer had been poured. Nature heals even deliberate cruelty. Sometimes I run into people who knew Ben's family. They usually look embarrassed and change direction. Once I saw Lisa at a coffee shop. She turned white and practically ran out. I didn't feel vindicated or happy about it, just sad that a whole family destroyed themselves because they couldn't accept that addiction is a disease, not a moral failing. I still have all the evidence in storage. Boxes of printed emails, USB drives of security footage, photos of every incident. My lawyer said I could probably throw it away now, but I keep it. Not because I'm paranoid, but because it reminds me that I fought back and won, that their money and connections couldn't silence truth. The treatment center invited me to speak at their anniversary gala. I talked about my father's journey and how stigma nearly destroyed my life. I told them about Ben's family and how their prejudice led to their downfall. The room was full of people in recovery, their families, and counselors who understood. Several people thanked me afterward for showing that recovery is something to be proud of, not hide. I'm dating again now. His name is David and he's a teacher. I told him the whole story on our 3rd date, expecting him to run. Instead, he said his sister was in recovery and he understood completely. He's met my friends, seen my security cameras, and never once made me feel paranoid or damaged. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. Ben's family showed me their cruelty. David shows me kindness. The medical practice closed after the scandal. The building was sold and turned into a community health center that serves low-income families. They offer addiction treatment services, among other things. There's something poetic about that. A place that once spread stigma now helps people heal. I kept the engagement ring box, but not the ring. Ben never asked for it back and I sold it to help pay for lawyers. The box sits on my shelf holding paper clips now. Sometimes I look at it and remember how different my life could have been. Married into a family that hated a fundamental part of who I am. Thank God for that horrible engagement party. My dad would have been proud of how I handled everything. He taught me to face hard truths and fight for what's right. He showed me that recovery is possible and stigma is just ignorance dressed up as concern. His sobriety gave me strength when Ben's family tried to use it against me. They thought his addiction made me weak. Really, it made me unstoppable. The last I heard, Richard was in federal prison teaching literacy classes. Caroline was working in the prison kitchen. Mark was in minimum security somewhere upstate. Ben was due for parole soon, but the restraining order was permanent. They'd lost everything trying to destroy me. Their medical licenses, their reputation, their freedom, their fortune, all because they couldn't accept that genetics isn't destiny and addiction isn't a moral failing. I still work at the same social services agency, still live in the same apartment, still visit my dad's grave with daisies, but everything's different now. I'm not scared anymore. Not checking locks obsessively or varying my routes. Not documenting every interaction in case I need evidence. I'm just living my life, helping people, honoring my father's memory. Sometimes clients ask how I stay strong in such a tough field. I tell them about my dad's recovery and how it inspired my career. I don't usually mention Ben's family unless it's relevant. That chapter's closed now, but the lessons remain. Document everything. Trust your instincts. Don't let anyone make you ashamed of where you come from. And always, always fight back against bullies, no matter how much money they have. The scholarship recipients from the treatment center send updates sometimes. People getting their lives back, reuniting with families, finding jobs. Each success story proves Ben's family wrong. Addiction isn't a death sentence or a genetic curse. It's a disease that can be treated. Recovery is possible. My dad proved it. Those scholarship recipients prove it. And I proved that no amount of money or connections can destroy truth when you refuse to back down.